Welcome to Rise and Relate with Rissa. And on today's episode, I will be discussing the removal of the ASWB examination. And for those that do not know, that is the Association of Social Work Board. This is where we go to take our state licensure, whether that is for a non-clinical license or for a clinical license. So in the great state of Illinois, Senator J.B. signed the HB 2365 providing an alternative to the ASWB back in August of 2023. Now, this bill is supposed to make a equitable path for social workers and remove a barrier to social workers being able to get their independent license. And as you all know, those that's in the social work field, going to get your independent license is its own process in itself. So the requirements differ among every single state based on the required hours that's needed and then the amount of supervision hours that is needed. But for a general sense, for those that are listening, you tend to need about 3,000 working hours in doing actual clinical social work, meaning direct therapy, somewhere where you are assessing, diagnosing, doing therapy, and then you need a certain amount of hour of clinical supervision. And that timeline to complete those requirements is on an average 2 years to 2 years and a half. So once a social worker has completed these steps, after they have graduated with their master's in social work, they will have to work for, most people can go work for schools, they go work for nonprofits. It's rare that people work for private practices because usually community mental health is where early on social workers can get their hours and get them fast and be able to complete that requirement before within that 2 year to 2.5 year time frame. Now, during this process, can be very unwavering and very unsettling for various social workers because it comes with so many different barriers, and especially as a Black woman and a Black male. During this process of 2 years of working for these different agencies, a lot of Black male and Black women, by the time it's time for them to even sit and qualify for the exam, they have either became so burnt out that they don't even want to take the exam. They have either decided, you know what, this field is not for me, and they actually decide to go to a different alternative career path. At that time, they might just feel so overwhelmed that they even want to hold off before taking the exam. But essentially, I'm going to speak for myself. Getting to the ALCSW exam, and I'm in Maryland, so ours is called the ALCSWC. Getting to that exam is complete liberation and freedom because I have an independent license to practice social work in so many different capacities without experiencing a lot of the trauma that I endured through my process. So as I mentioned, when you are going through this process, it is not a guarantee that you will build the clinical experience that you need to be successful even after obtaining your clinical license. It is not indicative for those people that go and take that licensure exam and fail to say that, hey, they are not ready either. Because there are a lot of different things that happen in that process that deters, intervene, and cause havoc in someone being able to pass that clinical license exam. So what the Governor J.B. did in Illinois was said, hey, at this time we are at the utmost need. Social workers are in great demand, and especially after COVID, the mental health needs of our clients all around, us transitioning to virtual and being able to see clients literally anywhere in the world, no matter how rural, no matter how isolated. Hey, I have come up with this bill and this legislation that will remove those barriers and allow for more social workers to get that clinical licensure without having to constantly take that exam over and over. And those that are not, that do not know, this is just going to be a rough estimate. So to even prepare for your exam, it can easily cost you $2,400 to $3,000 to $5,000 to $6,000 within that 2-year span. And that is covering CEUs, clinical supervision, the test preparation, the test fees, the registration fees. So just imagine if you failed that exam, how much money you still have to funnel out. And when I was getting ready to take my exam, I was in this preparation group. When I say I seen clinicians fail that exam 6, 7, 8, 9 times. So it is a clear barrier, right? This exam is a clear barrier because these were clinicians that were seasoned in the field, that had been in the field 20 plus years, that know social work front and back. But the discrepancy with the exam and those social workers that's been in the field is that the exam is built for you to take that exam essentially fresh after graduate school or fresh after your bachelor's in order to best prepare to actually pass the exam. And if you take the exam with in mind, thinking about how you practice in the actual field, and you go into the exam with that mindset of like, okay, this is how we do it in my agency, or this is how we do it within my practice, you will answer those questions based on real life scenarios and how the hierarchy of the steps go in answering those questions. So with that in mind, people that have been out of the field for so long that want to come back to get fully licensed will fail that exam. And just imagine this. As I stated, seasoned social workers that have been in the field 15 years, they decided when they actually met the criteria, they decided that, hey, you know what? I'm not even going to go get my license, my independent license. I'm just going to carry on within the work that I'm doing with the licensure that I have or with the credentials that I have, which is their degree and their hours, to just stick at where they're at because it's just too much to think about going to get this independent license. So what JB is proposing caused a lot of controversial within the social work community. When someone posted about this bill being passed, I seen so many black social workers talking about, oh my God, it's going to be so terrible. We're going to have terrible social workers. They're not going to be ready. And it was just so much hate surrounding a policy, a bill that can actually help out their very own people. And this is what shook me so much because standardized tests, as we all know, are rooted in racism. They are rooted in creating barriers that keep students from being able to excel. And we all know there's plenty of research to back that standardized tests are not the end-all be-all for someone's intellectual ability. So what essentially the bill proposes is that social worker still goes through the regular process of the 3,000 clinical hours. They still go through the process of intensive clinical supervision. And then they have to try to pass the test at least once within the past 5 years. And then they have to do an additional 3,000 hours. Now, that is essentially the caveat to being able to then sign up and say, hey, I would like to apply for my clinical independent license by essentially doing 6,000 hours in clinical supervision. That's the alternative. So to say that even after someone have done these steps that they wouldn't be prepared is mind-blowing because, again, 3,000 hours does not mean that social worker would be prepared to do clinical work because, again, another barrier that happens is most Black women, Black men, supervisors do not look like them. So that creates a barrier in supervision because of the simple fact that Black people have to speak so many different communication styles when they are working in the field of social work. And what I mean by that is Code switching, of course, is one of that, but we do not have the flexibility and the space to be vulnerable. So we have to put on different communication styles based on what environment we are in order to just succeed. So that right there is a barrier in itself when you have, let's say, a white supervisor that don't understand that cultural aspect of how a black social worker have to navigate. And Linnell Plummer, a black woman, she actually created a model for white supervisors that have black supervisees to help create a structure on how to go about making sure that their black supervisees are able to succeed in social work after they go and apply for that independent license. And what she found in her research was that most white supervisors actually held their black supervisees back because they could not relate on helping them to develop. They actually, in clinical supervision, focus more on housekeeping things, on productivity, on the numbers, and on the agency needs, rather than focusing on what that black supervisee needed to succeed within their career. Meaning that if I am a black supervisee going into this process on the path for clinical supervision, and I want to own a private practice once I'm done, that means that my supervisor never actually prepared me for that role, because of every clinical supervision that we have will actually be focused on things that are not actually relevant to what I want to do long term. Another thing that Plummer realized within her research is that out of 18 black women that went through clinical supervision, only 4 of them actually became supervisors once they got done with supervision. Meaning that by the time that they got done, those black women were burnt out. Those black women were bitter because of all the discrimination and the racism that they experienced. Those black women struggle to want to be a supervisor because they did not see themselves. So this bill is essentially making another way, making another pathway for someone that is struggling to just pass, because by the time you're done, again, and after 2 years, the psychological effects that could be impacted on a social worker could literally deter their whole entire career. I talked to you guys last week on racial trauma. So just imagine 2 years of enduring that because you need your hours, being in survival mode, having those psychological effects, and those still impacting you when you go sit for that exam. So that is why it becomes a systematic issue and a barrier that needs to be dismantled. And with the new initiative, JB proposed that. Now, I am 100% for that because there are wonderful social workers that are phenomenal at what they do that cannot pass that exam. Now, this is where my my cons come in with the bill, because as I stated, in order to get to 3,000 hours, 9 times out of 10, you have to work in an environment that is not safe, that is not healthy, that is not conducive to your well-being. Black women, black social workers are rated the highest of them all to have to sacrifice their marriages, their children, their mental health needs in the process of trying to get their clinical supervision. So if JB proposed for us to do another 3,000 hours, that means that's 4 years of them having to endure the worst of the worst in their process in order to obtain that licensure. So, though I agree with this bill because it does serve as another alternative, it also could create another layer because now someone has to endure being underpaid, underworked, stressed out, ridiculous hours, changing supervisors all the time, supervisors that they do not connect with whatsoever, supervisors that are not trained in cultural sensitivity. That means it creates that barrier. And again, by the time someone's done with that process, 4 or 5 years, because supervision, again, finding a supervisor that is that's on the same page as you or someone that you can connect with can be very challenging. Is it possible? Absolutely. Shout out to my supervisor, Erica Kelly from Baltimore, Maryland. She was phenomenal. She is still someone I talk to. But even through my process, I went through over 6 supervisors in a 2-year span in order to get my hours. And I can tell you guys horror stories, which I will one day on this podcast tell you about what my clinical supervision process was. But by the time I even got to my supervisor, Erica, I was at the end of my hours. And even though she was a breath of fresh air and it was just relieving to have her, I was already traumatized, already impacted mentally, didn't even have the bandwidth or the capacity to see and do 40 hours of work so that I can literally finish up my last leg. So that process became a process of survival. And again, when you are in the social work field, and this is another thing that I definitely want to hit on, not today, but I want to hit on more in depth, is what happens in your social work journey as a Black social worker, male or female, your bachelor's level, your master's level, and then of course your doctoral level if you see fit, or your PhD level. What happens when you endure the racism and the trauma in that process in the social work program, and then you go in the field and you do an additional 2 more years to get this license? You are essentially in a state of survival for, on average, for 4 to 6 years. So you can just imagine that when you already come from an oppressed demographic and a marginalized demographic, the layers that is tossed on top of that and how that will impact you just long-term in your career, because it has long-term effects. So, like I said, this bill will be great. It goes into effect January 1st, 2024, so it's already in effect for social workers, which is great because it will help for those social workers with disability. It will help with social workers that are older, and then it will help, of course, with underrepresented social workers, which is us, Black men and women in the field that have difficulties passing this test. So if you are a social worker or just anyone that understands what this bill means, please feel free to comment below for those that's on my YouTube channel, and comment below for those that are listening through the podcast platform. But that's just my 2 cents and tidbit on that. But this needs to be talked about way more, and it truly needs to be discussed. Just the reactions of the Black community, the Black social work community, that needs to truly be discussed, because the fact that people are enraged and are really upset about this bill and degrading the social workers that is up next, as if something is indicative of one over the other. It doesn't matter. Those could be 20 years in the field and be terrible clinicians. Some could be 1 year in the field and be terrible. Nothing says someone is great at their job outside of someone being in their social work position doing a great job, and the only people that can say that they are great is that client population in which they are serving. Because I've seen people on both sides, licensed and not licensed, that don't deserve to practice because of their attitudes, their beliefs, and their perspectives when working in the social work field. So the fact to think that something is made for us and we essentially criticize it, and not even criticizing the bill, literally criticizing the products of people being able to just send in a notice and say, hey, I did my hours, can I practice, is flabbergasting to me. So I would love to hear you all's feedback on that. Thank you, and I will see you next week when we rise up and relate deeply on different topics in social work.